During this discussion, we're going to explore a number of avenues related to film and modernity, in particular the relationship between cinema and notions of national identity in the modern post-colonial world. What does it mean to be Indian? And what does it mean to make an Indian, or for that matter, British, Chinese, Singaporean film? We're also going to talk about how to talk about films in an academic university context. We all watch movies to relax, to chill out. Perhaps you haven't thought before how a film could be the basis for a class at school. A famous film critic once wrote, "A film is difficult to explain because it is easy to understand." I will attempt to show that there is a specific vocabulary, language, and discourse involved in critiquing film. This discourse holds cinema to be an art form and a text, one that has an author and must be decoded or read. Before we get to this brief lesson in cinema, first, let's talk about the context in which Charulata was made, post-colonial India. 2 weeks ago, we read Gandhi's Hind Swaraj. Gandhi, as we saw, was the figurehead of one of the most successful pacifist resistance movements in history. The British left India in 1947, as more or less as Gandhi wanted, as friends. Independent India's first years, however, were marked with turbulence, in particular related to the large portions of northern India, which were partitioned. India was now its own master, but soon it was bereft of its spiritual leader when Gandhi was assassinated in 1948. As events unfolded, India's path arguably deviated considerably from the Mahatma's principles and visions. Here's an image, which I thought you might enjoy. You recognize Gandhi, of course. Who's the other figure? Any ideas? Any ideas? It's a very famous person, but you might not recognize him like this. It's Charlie Chaplin. Yeah. Gandhi, as we learned, with no surprise, was not a cinephile. Too much machinery. But in this delightful contradiction, when in London for meetings about independence, he met with Chaplin. Perhaps the thing they have in common is, Gandhi was extremely conscious of the image, the potency of the mass-diffused image, which he used very expertly. Returning to India, some of its problems were endemic, but others also related to a result of its colonial heritage, 89 years of living under the British Raj. India's new leaders had to conceive a vision of India to forge its place in the world and develop a sense of self and identity. And its elite, up until that point, of course, had been highly implicated with British thought through their education in particular. Indeed, Western education had been introduced into India in 1835 and endorsed by the educated liberals among Indians. This had given rise to a bourgeois elite who formed an alliance with the Western liberals and advocated Western liberalism while also trying to maintain their Eastern traditions. Particularly in the northern province of Bengal, the yoking of British and indigenous cultures resulted in something called the Bengal Renaissance in the 19th century, whose leaders took up the challenge of reforming a backward, quote-unquote, society on the model of European Enlightenment. And their cherished goal was the seamless synthesis and harmony between Eastern and Western cultures. Indeed, a more enlightened treatment of women constituted a large part of this reform, with practices such as widow burning, sati, abolished. And women were offered education up to the college level. Widows were allowed to remarry. Indeed, it's the role of women in society where was perhaps the site where the encounter, the clash between West and East, traditional modernity, was the most violent. Upon independence, the task for Bengali and Indian leaders, thinkers and artists was how to navigate a path that was different from simply copying Western ways of modernity. Ways which we have seen in our readings so far are associated with a slew of ills: oppression, inequalities, alienation, ennui. And to find a path that celebrated and embraced Indian national identity. Here's another slide of a figure who was very key in the Bengal Renaissance. Can you identify him? Anyone? It's Rabindranath Tagore. Why is Tagore important to today's lecture? Well, he's the author of the story that Charulata was adapted from. Okay? I'm going to talk about Satyajit Ray, the filmmaker. He grew up in and the influences that exacted on his art and his filmmaking. He grew up in 1920s Calcutta, in the middle of an upper middle class Bengali family. His ancestors were at the forefront of the Bengali Renaissance. Now, Ray's chosen means of artistic expression, the art film, can be seen to owe a great deal to European culture and traditions. Now, as cinema is the art of storytelling, I'm going to tell a few stories, anecdotal stories, about his life. They may at first seem digressions, but you'll see with some patience they are interconnected. Now, once upon a time, there was a painter, and his name was Auguste Renoir. You might have heard of him. Now, Pierre-Auguste had a son, and his name was Jean. Jean wanted to be an artist too, but he could never rival remotely the painting of his father. Jean did, however, become an artist, a filmmaker. Jean was born at the turn of the century in Paris, and as a young man during World War I, he was shot in the leg. During a lengthy recuperation in hospital, he discovered cinema and the films of Charlie Chaplin in particular. Inspired by what he saw, he began a career in movie making, with his first 9 silent films starring his wife, Catherine Hessling. This is Renoir painted by his father. This is Renoir as a man and his wife. At first, his films were not commercially successful at all, and he had to sell his father's paintings in order to make them. With the beginnings of sound cinema, however, in the 1930s, Renoir had more luck. With his first films, Baby's Laxative and The Bitch, starring a very uniquely talented actor called Michel Simon. I'll show you a picture in a moment. His third film, however, was more serious, a biting satire on the Parisian bourgeois. And from then on, his films were acclaimed, not just for their politics, but also their poetics. Indeed, his films were at the heart of something called poetic realism, defined by one critic as the dreamy and lyrical representation of everyday life by virtue of their chiaro-oscuro lighting, background artifices, and evocative visual imagery. Does anything strike you about this description? Here are some images, by the way. This is Renoir's favorite actor. Quite a wild child, man. Anyway, doesn't it sound as if we're talking about a work of art from these descriptions? Indeed, French poetic realism was one of the first manifestations of the art film, the art house film, sometimes called. The genre that Satyajit Ray was also a part of. Indeed, the idea of film as art can be traced to its very beginning, when its founding fathers, whether it be Edison or the Lumiere brothers in France, were aware not only of its scientific properties, but also its artistic quality. And many film scholars believe that the very beginnings of cinema were its apogee, where it was the most beautiful and artistic, given the attention paid to what you saw, as opposed to having sound, which was a distraction from the image and corrupted the film. But what does all this have to do with Satyajit Ray of India? Well, quite concretely, Jean Renoir met the French director while he was filming a movie in India in 1951, Calcutta, called The River. The 30-year-old Ray, who was a long-time admirer of Renoir, seized the opportunity to meet with him and interview him, and they discussed cinema late into the night. They both admired Renoir's film called La Règle du jeu, The Rules of the Game, which was a biting satire of the French bourgeois, their attachment to rules, and their hysteria when faced with peril. In a moment, we're going to watch an extract of this and look and talk about it. As a filmmaker, Ray took to heart Renoir's advice. You don't need too many elements in a film. They have to be the right elements, the human elements. Indeed, both put human relationships ahead of technique and technical considerations, although these two were important. Now, Renoir was also the mentor to another group of filmmakers who began making films about the same time as Satyajit Ray. They were French, they were young, angry, they were smart. Their names are Jean-Luc, François, Claude, Eric, and Jacques, and quite a few of their friends. And they began their careers in filmmaking by skipping off university and watching movies all day. Yeah, think about it. I can't condone this, of course. But you see, cinema was their education. It was more interesting to them than the classes that they were taking. Their passion for cinema they had a passion for cinemas from all around the world: Africa, America, Latin America, and Asia. And their interest in film stemmed not just from this curiosity about the world, but a real disappointment that film in France after the war was deadly boring. They called it daddy's cinema, big budget, adaptations, costume dramas of absolute no relevance to their lives. Their mantra was to critique a film was the same as to make a film. And the idea here is that their criticism was so detailed of every aspect of the film that they might as well it's the same as making a film. And indeed, they went on to become filmmakers, very, very famous filmmakers. That's the poster for Renoir's film. Here is the journal that the French critics wrote for, the Cahiers du Cinéma. And in their reviews, published in this journal, these reviews contributed to establishing cinema as an art. They called it the seventh art. There are 6 other fine arts, and cinema would be the 7th. They would write about film lyrically, philosophically, and above all, critically. Film was a quote-unquote serious thing, to borrow the title of a review on Alfred Hitchcock, a director whom they lavish praise upon. They encouraged debate, even dissent, and argued their points of view passionately. Especially, they developed a lexicon, a grammar, and a syntax to analyzing film. Here are some of the critics, part of this group. So you'll notice they all smokers, which seems to go with being a French filmmaker, and the era. Now, one of their main ideas, quiet please. One of their main ideas when talking about a film was that the director was the author, and they called this auteur theory, auteur meaning author in French. And this theory states that the director's personal vision is the most important thing and should define a film. So in spite of all the other elements and people who work on the film. It's the director's creative vision which should shine through in a film, in a good film. And in an article, for instance, François, one of the critics, François Truffaut, said that, for instance, John Renoir's movies would always be more interesting than the best of movies by mediocre directors. He wrote, "There are no good or bad movies, only good or bad directors." And it's important that a director be able to recognize himself in a portrait that we draw of him and his films. They also wrote articles on Satyajit Ray, whom they really admired as a director, as an auteur. In 1955, they wrote that the hallmark of Ray's very great talent resides in his absolute sincerity, his acute sensitivity. The editing is sometimes deplorable, but the interest lies elsewhere, for instance, in the very beautiful positioning of figures within the frame. He is a craftsman. Okay, so this gives you a little idea of how they wrote about film. All right, we have another question. And then after this, we're going to begin a mini lesson in cinema and how to read a film, watching some clips. Okay? Okay, so what are the things that make up a film? Who goes on IMDb quite often? You go and see a movie, you really like it. Do you look it up on the internet, on IMDb? I do, I'm addicted to it, I have an app. So who are the main people involved in making a film? This was something that the French critics were interested in. Their theory was that the director, the author, was by far the most important person. But they also are aware that the other people obviously contribute too. So in a way, they have a difficult time just writing about the author. For instance, perhaps the second most important, or maybe the most important person, is the producer, the money man. And they would realize this when they began making films. You see, a filmmaker can't make a film without the money. And somebody who can, with the connections, to distribute a film. Okay, but not the most glamorous person. As part of this team, there's also the people on the set, the cinematographer. Here I've listed the people who worked on Charulata. Okay. Now, the cinematographer is in charge of all the technical aspects of filmmaking. Usually has a team of cameramen. Although quite often in the art film, it's just one person. He is the cameraman. Okay. In the case of Charulata, it was Subrata Mitra who worked on all of Ray's films, and in himself, he was very famous. Okay. Then, of course, we have the scriptwriter. In the case of Charulata, Ray wrote his own script. Again, the art film directors are very involved in every aspect of the film, as opposed to a huge Hollywood production where there's, 10 scriptwriters, for instance, or more. Okay, then we have the editor. What does the editor do? Well, once all the film footage comes in, he's the one who has to put it all together. And in the olden days, before digital, this was literally a cut and paste job, a glue. They would take strips and glue it to the next strip. It's great, and you're on a slicing board, something you see in museums now. Okay, who are the other big players? There's the art and production designer. Again, Charulata, quite a famous guy in his own right. And these are in charge of the sets, the decor, the location. All right. Other than this, there's also the sound and music people. The musical score is the word we call for basically the soundtrack, the music that goes on during a film. Now, what are the components of a film? How do you begin to analyze it, to talk about the formal aspects? Well, here's a chart, basically a kind of overview. And, we we don't have the time to go into detail of each of these, but hopefully in your classes this week, with your instructors, you might be able to look at them in more detail. The ones I'm going to concentrate on are away from the basic, the obvious things, the story, as actors, the plot, subplot, but to concentrate on mise en scène and cinematography. What does mise en scène mean? It's another French word. It's a theatre term. Basically means the set, everything to do with the set. But also the costumes, the lighting, and even the acting styles come under mise en scène. It's basically how the scene is prepared. Then we come to the more technical aspects of cinematography. Okay, this is defined by the speed, okay, the camera angles in particular. And a camera can do lots of things. It can stand still. It can be put on a tracking device where it moves. It can also stand still but move from side to side. That means to pan or to tilt. Then there's the angle, the compositions of the frame, and also the focus. Is it deep or shallow? Is one person in focus and the background blurred? Or is everyone kind of in focus? Sound, of course, is actually quite a complicated part of a film. Does it come from, are the sounds kind of corresponding to the actions? Of course, there's sound effects, ones which in the music. There's actually quite science to sound production. Another one I want to concentrate on, though, yet another French word, montage, means editing. This putting together. Basically, a film is made up of frames. Now, there are 24 frames a second. When you a single frame is a single image, basically. These images are put together very rapidly, and they make up a shot. Now, a shot is basically a take. So if I'm filming you, record, cut. That's my shot. Now, if I do another shot from a different angle and put it together, that becomes a sequence. Okay? And in filmmaking, we talk about sequences as opposed to scenes, which is theatre. The way they can be put together, these different shots, is there's quite a lot of ways. Is it a nice smooth transition, or is it a jump from here to there? Also, how rapidly, how short are these takes? And this determines the rhythm or the pace of a movie. And this brings me to my first question that I want to ask you. When you watch Charulata, tell me about the pace, okay? And, yes, what do I hear? Could somebody take the microphone? Even. We have a microphone there. So my question is, in fact, who found Charulata to be slow-paced? But why? Why? Tell me why. Someone take the microphone? Anybody? What makes this film slow? Anybody? Could you explain why? Anybody? Can you? Yeah, Phil. Next slide. Okay. Yeah, I think, anyone else want to explain? Why is it slow? Okay, right. Very concretely, yes, you're right. It's in this film, the sequences are very long, and they go on and on and on. One critic wrote, the long sequences lovingly delineate Charu's ennui, her boredom. They constitute Ray's defiant assertion that what is supposed to be of no interest to anybody can be beautiful. All right. So there's a difficult question. I'm not sure I should ask it. Who found Charulata boring? Okay. Do you want to explain why?
There were long instances whereby she practically did nothing and just
Okay.
stared out the window.
I agree, absolutely. Yeah. You know, just get on with something, really. Although we're going to talk about this boredom. You know, does this boredom make it a bad film? I think it's a very different question from whether we were bored. And when I was at school, a professor of mine always used to say, boredom is an undervalued experience. You know, you should enjoy being bored. Learn to enjoy being bored. Okay. It's a strategy Ray is adopting, and he achieves it through these very long takes. All right. The kind of films perhaps we're more used to are films that are faster and more fast-paced, like if we watch chase films, gangster films. Okay, and how do they achieve this? Well, quite often is through very rapid editing. Well, editing where the sequences come shots come very rapidly one after the other. I'm going to show you an example. Okay, it comes from a film. It's a gangster film made by one of the French critics. It's his first film. And it's the story of a gangster on the way to Paris to see the woman who he's in love with. Now, I want you to watch it. It's an incredibly short sequence. I want you to count how many shots make up this sequence. Okay? You ready? And then tell me what you saw.
Ne bouge pas ou je te brûle.
Yeah, and what happened? What did you see? Yeah? Somebody kills a policeman. Did you actually see him kill the policeman? No. But you piece it together, you see. And this is it's called a jump cut, where the scenes move from one thing to the next without any transition, and you're kind of taken aback. But it gives it an energy, a very fast-paced rhythm, and he does this throughout the whole film. And basically, this tells the story just in these 10 seconds. Okay, so we're going to think a bit more about that. In a moment, we're going to watch the Renoir film, but before that, indeed, a little question. Okay. Now we're going to watch a clip from the film that Renoir and Ray loved. It's Renoir's own film. There are two questions I want you to think about. First is, how is this film comparable to Charulata? Okay? How is it the same? How is it different? The second question is quite simple. What do you see? Okay, it's deceptively simple. I want you to look at the framing and the cinematography. I want you to tell me what the angles and the shots do. What is their function? What effect does it engender? Okay? So, what do you see? But pay very fine attention to that question. Okay? Here goes.
Telle que servant de téléloupe à peu de distance, vous examinez ce petit écureuil sans l'intimider et vous vivez toute sa vie intime.
Bon, bien, c'est entendu, vous allez tout dire à Christine. Ça vous avancera à quoi?
À vous faire du mal.
Charmante nature.
Ça m'ennuie de souffrir seul, oui. J'ai l'impression qu'en bande, ça doit être moins ennuyeux. Et puis, j'ai envie de voir la tête que vous ferez quand Christine vous aura quitté. Je pense qu'elle vous quittera si je lui parle.
Ça ne fait pas l'ombre d'un pli.
Vous l'aimez vraiment. Et moi, vous ne m'aimez plus du tout.
Oh mon Dieu, j'ai envie de changer de conversation. Et ma position de berger Paris sans la pomme me semble d'un grotesque.
Je vous prie de me répondre.
Non, je ne vous aime pas. J'ai beaucoup de sympathie pour vous. Mais
je vous ennuie.
Ennui. Et vous avez des mots, ma chère.
C'est le mot exact. Je ne lutte plus. On lutte contre la haine, mais contre l'ennui, il n'y a rien à faire. Oh! Merci. Oh, puis moi aussi, je commence à trouver tout ça assommant. Quand je vous vois faire le céladon auprès de votre viennoise, ça me donne envie de bailler. Je vais partir.
Je crois que ça vaudra mieux, Geneviève.
Oui, je vais partir. Mais je voudrais que vous me disiez adieu, très gentiment.
Non, adieu. Au revoir, Geneviève.
Non, non, adieu. Mais un bel adieu. Je voudrais pendant quelques secondes me sentir transportée 3 ans en arrière. Oui, à l'époque où Christine n'existait pas. Je voudrais que vous me preniez dans vos bras comme vous le faisiez alors. Je vais fermer les yeux. Je vais croire un instant tout ce que je vais vouloir.
Voyons, Geneviève.
Non, non, ne parlez pas. Embrasse-moi.
Mon petit.
Vous mettez les coups, c'est un peu... Extraordinaire. Oh, la poule d'eau. On pourrait compter les plumes.
Elle a disparu. Vous le voyez encore, vous?
Non, et pourtant j'ai de bons idées, chère madame.
Merci.
À 2 doigts de l'arbre à boules. 3 pour les vôtres, parce qu'ils sont plus petits.
Oh,
Elle est pas de passe. J'ai envie de boire, moi aussi.
Comme c'est joli.
Bon, ben, passe-le, moi.
Mais non.
Mais je te jure que c'est mon tour.
Non,
Dis donc, ça a l'air beaucoup intéressant ce que tu vois là-bas.
très intéressant.
Ah, the French. The French being French. Affairs. Yes. So, what did you see? Anybody? Could somebody tell me what they saw? Anything, what did you see? Somebody? A volunteer? Anybody? Alvin? First, just tell me what you saw. Really, describe. Sorry, Alvin.
Project.
How to express it? Basically, it's about this couple. We are actually seeing a couple who the man wants to initiate a breakup, so the woman wants to give him wants him to give her a farewell before that happens, and
Right.
well, let's just say they got caught in that.
Yes.
Possibly by the certain Christina as well.
Caught in the act. That's right. You understand they were married, and that's the mistress. But he's with the mistress, and the wife is the one watching. Okay. What else did you see? Don't be afraid. It's not a trick question. Nobody? Phil, what did you see?
What did I see?
Yes.
I saw a missed opportunity for the unfaithful man to drown in quicksand. That's how I would have written it.
Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, well, what frames did he use to tell this short story, this episode? Okay, it begins with, what's the first image, you remember? A squirrel, that's it. The close-up through a telescopic lens showing the private life of a squirrel. Okay. In art film, in these films, there's always a reflection on cinematography. They love filmmaking. They love pointing the cameras in different places. Okay, and it makes you realize that that is what they're doing. Okay, it also invites you to think about, outside of the human drama. Look at squirrel dramas. Okay, then what happens? You see the man with his mistress, and they're walking along. How does the camera look at them? Well, if you notice it's stationary, but it pans. It's following them. It's observing them. It's like an eye, okay? And it invites you to observe them. But then you're drawn in as the frame becomes a medium shot. You see them in more closely. Okay, and in cinema terms, so the camera leans in, and then you get this close-up of the mistress. What did you think? Some of you laughed. Why did you laugh when you saw her her close-up. Anyone? Any thoughts on that? You know, you're invited to look at her closely, her expressions. What do they reveal about her? She looks pretty crafty, this story about our final goodbye. She knows what she's doing, okay? And we know that because we're invited to look at her in this way, okay? Then you get a long shot of the kind of a more general picture, how the character's interacting, and then you're invited to look through the binoculars. Okay, what's the effect of this? Well, we're invited to share her gaze. We're invited to see what she is seeing, okay? And when we see what she is seeing, we can begin to think what she is thinking, okay? We assume her point of view, okay? And this idea, the idea of constituting points of views and sharing people's gaze, the way they look at something, is a technique, okay, that you see often in art house films. All right, good. Now I think we're ready to watch a brief extract of Charulata, and my question is the same. In these extracts, what do you see? Okay? What do you see, and what does it mean? All right? Also, be thinking about how does this film comparable with Renoir's film. It's another extract. Did it make you feel dizzy? Did you find that scene beautiful? I think it is very aesthetically beautiful. We're running out of time, actually, so we don't have time to do much more interactive discussion. But hopefully, you can continue this in your classes this week. What I'm going to finish on is a short reading, okay, an interpretation of this scene and of the film generally. So if you just bear with me 5 minutes, I'm going to outline this. So basically, my comments will be about, there's a lot of people who consider Ray, like I said at the beginning, to be basically just a kind of make a European film, okay? Perhaps he's not even Indian. He's making films like Jean Renoir, okay? You know, this attention to the gaze, the very beautiful crafted films, okay? And this comes from Europe, basically. And so people say, well, Ray, he's not really an Indian filmmaker. He's very good at copying this European style, okay? And so does he have really authenticity as an Indian filmmaker? And is this an Indian national film? Okay. They point out, for instance, that Ray was given an Oscar at the end of his life, and he was thrilled. This was the high point of his career. I'd like to explore the other point of view, however, that his films, yes, they are steeped in, they do borrow from European tradition, but they are also Indo-centric and a very subtle, fine consideration of problems very specific to India, and in particular, newly independent India. How so? You might be surprised. First, well, the fact that it's an adaptation from the Tagore is a very important aspect. Tagore was a giant of Bengali literature, okay? And you know, by adapting his work, he's basing his film very much in the Bengali traditions. Okay, Tagore was paid great attention to language and expression and verse, and innovated the Bengali language. And Ray himself refused to make any films in English. Even when his films earned him more money in America, he always wrote the script in Bengali. Okay? Added to that, the people he drew upon in his films, the cast and crew were Indian, and some of them very famous. Do you know the musician Ravi Shankar? He composed the music to his first films. So this was a set of artists working very specifically in Bengal. Returning to the Tagore theme, I mentioned earlier that Tagore was extremely concerned about women's rights, and he considered that women were neglected. India was not making use of their talents, was not giving them equality. He considered men to have become destroyers of their women, not necessarily out of evil, but out of learned behavior and social customs. So Tagore was very not radical in a way of exploring female subjectivity and this question of female desire. And this is a very specifically Indian problem, and the way he does it is very specifically in this context. Mostly because basically the West had moved on in quite a considerable way. Emancipation, both at the time of Tagore and the time that Ray made this film, feminism existed as a movement, emancipation, sexual liberation was a reality. Whereas in India, it has to be said that that women generally enjoyed very few fruits of emancipation. And indeed, women such as Charulata were almost confined to their homes. Okay, we notice she goes out into the garden, but perhaps you get the impression that's the extent of where she's allowed to go. But I think my most strongest claim to positing this film as very Indocentric is the way in which Ray's film invites us, the spectator, to look at both at Charu's world as well as the legacy of 19th century colonialism and its impact on the present. We've noticed this presence of the looking glasses. As one critic explains, the film is premised on the notion of the gaze, of a looking that verges sometimes on the voyeuristic. Indeed, these looking glasses denote an examination under a magnifying glass of her world and the world around her. And we're invited to look upon, share, and even experience for ourselves Charu's inner conflict, her desire, her strained sense of loyalty and duty, and her terrible frustration and sense of bourgeois ennui. Now, this sequence in the swings, it's a moment of great beauty, aesthetic beauty. And on its own, it could talk just about the joys of youth and beauty, while belying a sense of fragility and anxiety about life. But what about if we entertain a notion of Charulata as a metaphor for India, a personification of the nation? We arrive, therefore, at a more politicized reading of this film. Charu's conflict is shared by a nation. This choice she must make is between remaining loyal to a caring husband or betraying him by indulging her selfish feelings, of supporting a rational man of the world in his intellectual pursuit to define a post-British India, or abandoning herself to a life of aesthetics, art, writing, and love, of pursuing ideas of progress and modernity, or revisiting the lost traditions of the past. Ray doesn't offer any solutions to these quandaries, and this is really conveyed in the final sequence of the film. Charu's gaze at this point has been transformed into one that was amorous, playful, and lustful, into one that is now fraught and despairing. Her husband, Bhupati's gaze expresses dejection and grief. And in the very final frame, the estranged couple hold out their hands, offering the possibility of reconciliation, but significantly we note that they do not touch. Indeed, I have a still of this. Of course, one could also argue that this is evocative of another famous scene involving two hands, Michelangelo's famous fresque. Again, we return to the European influence on Ray's film. However, I hope to have shown that he is and can be considered a filmmaker dealing with very Indian questions, and questions of national identity in particular. So just as final concluding remarks, the state of cinema today is assessed often in relationship to Hollywood, which is the most powerful, internationally powerful cinema in the country. But of course, what is its biggest rival? Any idea? Bollywood, which actually has more ticket sales, 4 billion plus, than Hollywood. Okay, it doesn't have the same revenues, but it's an interesting phenomenon. As a very parting thought, I'll invite you to think about these questions in a broader context. What is national identity? How is it constructed, in particular through film? Does Singapore have a national cinema? More broadly, what are the spheres of influence that exact on our lives? In this increasingly globalized world, how are the choices we make when selecting what movie to see on a Friday night, but also when buying a product in the store, choosing a school, choosing a career, a lifestyle, or a partner? How are they influenced by the discourses, the dominant cultural discourses that surround and sometimes invade our environments? Okay, thank you very much.